anti-corruption reform agenda, which embraces this all-society, all-government approach. So we all have a role, and we are all responsible. Let's own this strategy. I'm not speaking, I'm speaking out of real conviction. I think this is the right strategy. And I think Professor Stone will agree. And if we can reach that, build that consensus, we can start to think of all of you who are in this room as part of a movement to fight corruption. Because one of the critical success factors, one of the pillars of the strategy, and one of the critical success factors recognized internationally in the fight against corruption is the involvement of your people, is their participation in these initiatives. Because it is the people who have to hold their representatives accountable. If we don't get that pillar in place, we will not succeed. So those are the two objectives we are pursuing. And this summit, in that sense, should help us with a step change. The anti-corruption fight, in a sense, started with the appointment by the President of the Commission and an appointing highest judicial officer to chair that commission. So the evidence is now clear. The reality of corruption in our country is not questionable. But the next step is to support the implementation of the strategy. So what is the vision of this national anti-corruption strategy? There are 4 elements there: an ethical, transparent, and accountable state, citizens who respect the rule of law and are empowered to hold those in power account, and those who are in power have to be willing to be held to account. I'm speaking to our leaders who are sitting in front. Zero tolerance of corruption in any sphere of activity, and substantially reduced levels of corruption. That's our vision. Because for any strategy, there has to be an orientation. We have a clear orientation about what we want to achieve and what we are capable of achieving, what is realistic to set as an objective. What are the strategic pillars of the strategy? Are they up there? Yeah. There are 6 of them. These pillars were the product of intensive work, consultation with civil society, experts in the field. We should be thinking about these pillars as interrelated elements of a holistic approach to the fight against corruption. So the first one, not accidentally, is that we want to promote and encourage an active citizenry, whistleblowing, integrity, and transparency in all spheres of society. I said to you that that is the most essential element in the fight. Advance the professionalization of the public service. Of course, this is a huge task. This is not a task that's going to be accomplished overnight. But if this country's democracy is to be stabilized and consolidated, we know from our own experience, and not because we're borrowing advice from elsewhere, that is what we need. We need a state that serves our people, that can deliver, that can comply with the Constitution, that can deliver services. That's why we need to professionalize the public service. It's going to take time, but if we are committed to that project, we will accomplish this goal. We want to enhance governance, oversight, and consequence management in organizations. For that, we're going to have to work with the department, we're going to have to work with the Public Service Commission. Problems of a lack of discipline in departments are apparently intractable, but if we aren't able to ensure that we have accountability within departments that are meant to deliver services, we're not going to succeed. So it is right that we emphasize governance and oversight, and that doesn't depend on what Shamila does. That depends on what the rest of us in the room do, or at least those of us who have responsibility in government. Improve the integrity and credibility of public procurement. It comes also out of Justice Zondo's commission. Strengthening the resourcing, coordination, performance, accountability, and independence of dedicated anti-corruption agencies. And there, let's stop pointing fingers, but let's make sure that the law enforcement agencies have the resources that they need, the independence that they need to ensure that that fifth pillar is an effective part of our anti-corruption strategy, and then to protect the vulnerable sectors, because we know that we have to eat this elephant piecemeal, but of course strategically, know exactly where to bite. The NACAC mandate, the National Anti-Corruption Council, which was appointed.
Sorry, there is this sound here that is competing with the presentation. Can we assist? Because now it has become a detraction. It is? Okay, thank you.
Maybe those are the complaints of those who expect us to get this right. Okay, so the mandate, the pillars, by the way, Dr. Ntakumba, the head of the Secretariat, where's Stanley? He's going to be presenting the pillars in detail later on. So think about the rest of the summit, because you are going to be discussing these pillars when we break up into groups, and you're going to receive presentations from the councillors on the work that we've been doing. So our mandate is to advise on the effective implementation of this strategy, advise on the strengthening of South Africa's anti-corruption architecture, and we know from the receipts we've received that many of you are interested in what we're going to be saying about whether we need a new anti-corruption agency or not, what its powers and functions should be, and so forth. We have some clear thoughts about this matter, which we're going to be presenting for your input, and we're hoping to make our first recommendations to the President on this complex matter by February next year. Host anti-corruption summits, which we're now doing. This is the first one, and as I say, we're putting a lot of weight on the summit for reasons I'm going to explain, and then advise on the implementation of the Zondo Commission's recommendations. So, Chief Justice, we are paying a lot of attention to your findings. We are considering them carefully, and I can indicate to you that we will shortly be meeting the Chief Justice, probably in the next 10 days or so. Is it on that side? Okay, those are our work streams. So we have We have divided the council into these work streams, more or less based on the pillars and our priorities. The institutional architecture work stream is headed by Dave Lewis. Whistleblower support by Tandeka. Legislative reform and transparency is Kavisha. Public procurement reform advocate Kumalo. Communications and engagement, two powerhouses there are our deputy chairperson, Nkosikasi Mahlauli, who's unfortunately not able to be here because she got injured boarding a flight, and then Councillor Dolopi, and then monitoring and evaluation, Sekutlani Pamodi, who's sitting over there. So that's how we divide it up. Each one of these work streams has a reference group drawn from civil society and experts. We're working virtually on a continuous basis. The council president meets in plenary session once a month, and the work continues, even though we're on a kind of part-time basis, but we're putting the effort in. We are conscious of the weight that and the responsibility that we carry, and we are trying to fulfill that mandate and to shoulder that responsibility. This slide just covers some of our work, which I've already gone into. We've also had a stakeholder planning meeting in January. The council has visited 2 provinces already. We've had numerous meetings with all the law enforcement agencies, and let me explain why. Precisely because we have a sense of responsibility, we're not simply trying to borrow models by looking at other jurisdictions. We're trying to understand the institutional infrastructure as it currently exists. We have to be aware of what their interests are, what their perspectives are, in thinking about whether or not we need a new anti-corruption agency, and we have to understand the impact that any proposal we make will have. I mean, General Abia heads the DPCI. They are doing a lot of, I don't know how many cases you are currently running, General Abia. 21,000 cases. I learned about that, by the way. It became clear to me when I visited Limpopo and I started to understand how many cases of corruption are being investigated in that province and local authorities there. So we have to be thinking about what recommendations we make, what impact it will have on the DPCI, and likewise every other body. And I can tell you there are centers of excellence there. The SIU does tremendous work. And I think the MPA also deserves some credit for the progress they've made over the last 2 years. We've issued 4 advisories to the President, 2 on whistleblowing, 1 on political party funding. And I want to say, while the President is here and many of the politicians are here, I know that this is a matter on which many members of political parties, for very good reasons, because political parties need funding, will have reservations. But the international experience and our own experience is very clear. We have to ensure that party funding is accountable. We have to ensure that lobbyists, plutocrats, are not able to subvert the democratic process. That is essential. If there's one thing that we have to get right, is the regulation of party funding. If we want to avoid bigger corruption problems in the future. And again, I think the Chief Justice's, the evidence before you, sir, will have attested to that. And I want to be able to say so without fear or favor. I have a history of political activism, involvement in government, and so forth. I think that this is a no-brainer. It has to be done, and it should be done without reservation, without qualification. We have to do it. Some mix of public funding and all private funding should be accountable. We had two fantastic study tours to Kenya. Kenya, by the way, has very interesting experiences, a lot for us to learn from. They borrowed from our constitution. By the way, they now have their second anti-corruption commission, Chief Justice, because the first one was dismantled. And the first one was dismantled when they started to tackle corruption effectively. So, President, no, it's a fact. So let's be very clear. We're going to travel this road. We may be setting up new institutions, and we have to make them future-proof. Nobody should be able to dismantle the institutions we set up to fight corruption. They did that in Kenya. They learned their lesson. They now have a new body in place. And by the way, Comrade President, that body is staffed with highly impressive people, very capable. I was proud to be an African, to visit their country. It's a fantastic country. They are doing it, and we can learn from them. And if we're prepared to, we might do it just a little bit better. And then Kavisha ran a brilliant multi-stakeholder conference on using data analytics to combat corruption. I think technology is going to be a big element of the fight. Was it Professor Stone was saying to us last night that in some jurisdictions they're now introducing, is it digital forensics? And that is making a huge difference to the capacity of law enforcement agencies. So we're going to have to make the investment. We're going to have to make the investment for reasons that Professor Fikuleni touched on, and which I will shortly conclude on. So what is the second objective of this summit? Is to crystallize the idea that we are part of a movement, an emerging movement. Now, I was going to use last night when I was preparing the slides, last night, I'm coming to an end shortly, but I have to have the punchline. I was going to talk about coalitions, President, a coalition. But then I thought maybe that's not such a good idea because it might scare you guys too much. So let's talk about a movement. That's language that we do understand. So what do I mean by a movement? I don't mean a formal organization with a leadership. We've already got a president. An informal type of movement which has a consensus that the national anti-corruption strategy should form the basis of the country's reform agenda. We should unite around the strategy, the implementation of the strategy. Develop a consensus on the goals, priorities, and sequencing of anti-corruption reform initiatives. We have to do it all, but we have to do it strategically by identifying priorities and being clear about the sequencing. What are the priorities? How are you going to eat this? Maybe procurement, because that's where maybe the biggest immediate challenge. That consists of social partners who share information, ideas, and perspectives with a view to facilitating independent and collective action on a voluntary basis, and which encourages a culture of zero tolerance. Now, this is where you started, Professor. I'm MD. Why is the fight important? Let's understand that it's got to do with the health care of our people, their basic needs, their safety and security, sanitation, our dignity. We are fighting to preserve our constitutional order. We're fighting to defend our democratic freedoms. And we're fighting for our country's hopes and dreams. So let anti-corruption be prioritized as part of our national agenda, and that depends on your active participation. Over the next 2 days, we're going to take, hopefully, important step-ups to build this movement and to extend this consensus around the country's anti-corruption agenda. Thank you all for your participation. I look forward to the deliberations over the next 2 days, and I hope that we can achieve the objectives we've set. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Can we again put our hands together for the chairperson of NACAC? He's taken us through a journey of what they've been doing since establishment, and it looks promising and impressive. Without wasting time, we will now, of course, one key thing amongst many important points he made, the lessons from the Springbok team. How do they do it and win? Beyond just what they've done to the psyche of a nation, it's not just the people on the ground, it's the planning, and it's the whole ecosystem for success. And that in itself is very important. Now let's move without any delay to ask for our minister in the presidency, Minister Ramaphosa, to introduce our keynote speaker, who needs no introduction. Unless you have not done your civic lessons, you have not voted. Unless we were to say which high school he went to and so forth, but the head of state needs no introduction. But I call upon Minister to introduce.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Let me take this opportunity to thank you, Professor Fikeni. Let me also take this opportunity, of course, to acknowledge the President of the Republic of South Africa, who has also been appointed just now as the leader of the movement of anti-corruption. Congratulations. Let me also take this opportunity, of course, to all and also to take this opportunity, of course, to acknowledge the presence of Professor Kachalia, as well as the councillors that are here today. And also take this opportunity, of course, to acknowledge the presence of my colleagues, ministers, deputy ministers, members of the diplomatic corps and development agencies that are here, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, and members of this movement. The president have just told me that if I speak a lot, I'll be fired. So I don't want to be out of a job today. But of course, as Professor Fiken has already said, we do know the president very well. One of the things that I just want to say before I speak about him is that I've acknowledged and seen that on almost all the things that have been written here, especially that have been said by the councillors. I think those are the things that we need to remember them of, is the issue of active citizenry. And I think this is one of the things that Professor Kachalia has also spoken about that. And in trying to now introduce the president, of course, I don't think there's anyone who's more well-rounded like him. Precisely because when you talk about active citizenry, you speak about people that need to be in the movement who represent labor. The president have been there and led labor when he led NUM. You also speak about civil society, and is part of that because he has also led UDM. UDF, not UDM. We are also speaking about the political parties. He has led political parties. We are speaking about a well-rounded person that has also served in the state, the entire state, not only in executive, but also in the National Assembly. Then you also speak about someone who definitely is a true South African because he has made sure that he speaks to the issues of fighting against something that is depleting the moral of society, most especially because once you talk about corruption, you are going to talk about something that is enabling the state to be able to do what it does best, which is to intervene. So having said that, Mr. President, I haven't said much, so I guess I kept my job. Please join me as we welcome the President to come and address us today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Minister. I'd like to start off by apologizing for a late arrival. As you heard, I was still busy with my day job, chairing a cabinet committee meeting, which was much longer than we had anticipated. Proof thereof is also the late arrival of the Director General, who is the Cabinet Secretary. So I've got evidence, Chief Justice. So I apologize for that. When I said that to Professor Kachalia, he said, well, is attending an anti-corruption forum or summit your after-day job? No, it isn't. It is my everyday job as well. So that's important for you to realize. So thank you very much, Program Director, Professor Fikeni, and I'd like to also acknowledge the presence here of Chief Justice Raymond Zondo and the chairperson, as represented through Professor Kachalia of the National Anti-Corruption Advisory Council. And I also want to recognize members of the council who are here present, as well as ministers and deputy ministers who are also in attendance. And I'd like to welcome Professor Stone, who is a guest speaker. I'd like to thank you for traveling all the way from the UK, from Oxford University, to be with us. And of course, I also welcome members of the Diplomatic Corps. I see diplomacy written on all your foreheads, so I thank you for being here as well. And of course, importantly, leaders of various organizations in our society who represent the voices and the views of our people on the issues of corruption and just social development. And all of you as distinguished guests and ladies and gentlemen, next year in 2024, we will be celebrating 30 years of freedom. A freedom that the people of South Africa won very hard after many years of struggle, 342 years of struggle against colonialism and apartheid. We will, when we get to that point, as we will, reflect on how far we have come as a country in improving the lives of our people, the quality of their lives, and also, and more importantly, in entrenching a culture of democracy and human rights. A culture that, as we look around the world, we're finding either diminishing or being completely destroyed in other locales in the world. We will reflect on whether we are still on course to uphold that culture which we held with our two hands when we went to the polls on the 27th of April in 1994. We will reflect on the progressive policies that have enabled millions of our people to be lifted out of absolute poverty, and that have provided how this new democratic system has provided basic necessities which they didn't have at hand on a wholesome or on a universal basis, such as housing, access to electricity, to water, and other basic services. We will also at the same time acknowledge where we have not achieved enough, where the expectations and the aspirations of our people have not been met. It's going to be like looking at a balance sheet. When you look at the balance sheet, you look at your assets and you look at your liabilities, both positive and negative. That we will have to do. It's going to be a balance sheet moment or examination moment for us. But we will also look at the promise of the democracy that our people had, whether it has fallen short or not. As we consider the great achievements of our democracy, we must be forthright about one of the great weaknesses where we have fallen short, and that is with regard to corruption. All South Africans suffer from corruption when goods and services and resources meant for public benefit are misappropriated, they are mismanaged, they are stolen, and when that happens, it is the poor who suffer the most. Corruption carries a huge opportunity cost, but it imposes a huge burden on the lives of our people. Economic growth is stifled and businesses suffer. Development stalls and institutions across the board, both in the public sector and in the private sector, also fail. Corruption has wounded our democracy in a number of ways and has also shaken our people's faith in our institutions. If corruption is not curbed, arrested, or stopped, the greatest damage will not be in the funds that are stolen, and funds are stolen, or the jobs that are lost. It will be in damaging our democracy. It will be in making our people have less confidence and have less trust in our democracy. It is therefore our shared responsibility as we celebrate 30 years of democracy to build a society in which corruption is minimized or eliminated, in fact, has no place at all. To do so, we must challenge the contention that corruption is a creation of our democratic order. Because there are people in certain circles who believe that this is a new invention that came post-1994. Corruption in South Africa has many deep roots. As we have noted before, apartheid itself was both morally and materially corrupt. even as apartheid laws enabled the theft and the unbridled theft of resources that rightfully belong to the people of South Africa, there were many in the administration, in state institutions, in the Bantustans, so-called governments, and in business, who flouted even those corrupt laws to enrich themselves. And sometimes we never give a moment to think about how corruption permeated all of society during the years of apartheid misrule. Having fought a just struggle against this system of apartheid, it was our intention that the overthrow of apartheid would herald a new era of integrity, of honesty, and ethical conduct by all who are in positions of responsibility. We sought not merely to change the political system, but to build a new nation on a fundamentally different moral code or foundation. Our Constitution, which embeds the values of social justice, human dignity, accountability, transparency, and the rule of law, is the most powerful instrument we have to fight crime and corruption. Often dubbed as one of the best constitutions in the world, this is the instrument that our people have at hand. The people of South Africa are the guarantors of the integrity of the political, social, and economic life of our country. After all, it was the people of South Africa in all their various formations who stood up against not only apartheid, but who also stood up against state capture, and who through their democratic institutions took action to have a commission established and took action to support the commission that had been established, even against difficult odds. Even when the head of that commission was being criticized, pummeled with lots of attacks, it was the people of South Africa who supported the work of that commission. The establishment of that commission was an affirmation of the strength of our democracy. And this, in many ways, is what distinguishes us from a number of countries in the world. In a number of countries, corruption is endemic. People know that it happens. It happens even in your best so-called democracies. You know, when we went through, I digress for a minute, when we went through the COVID-19 PPEs, the personal protective equipment, and mistakenly, and that's where I sometimes say, yeah, we made a mistake. Or I also made a mistake to say, yes, we will have these PPEs distributed and sent to our people because this was a moment of great need. And people set up companies just 2 or 3 days before PPEs were made available, and the money was there. They saw it coming and they grabbed the opportunity. But it was interesting to read that the experience that we went through was similar to the experience that other more developed economy countries went through, the UK, the US, and many other countries, and of course, a number of African countries. It's not that it was sobering, but what we did afterwards was, for me, much more important, because one, we learned a lesson. when we had to now have to deal with vaccines, we decided that this is centralized. It will only be distributed by the state. It will only be bought by the state and not bought by a whole number of other people and charge the state. So we had learned a lesson. But the other important lesson was to ensure that we follow up that act of corruption. We set up what we call the Fusion Center, which brought together the various corruption-fighting and crime-fighting agencies, from SARS, tax collector, right through to the National Prosecuting Agency and the SIU and the NP and the Hawks and all that. They worked together. And I often said, for the first time, we were able to have proper integration in tackling a particular problem in government, where institutions worked together to good effect. But what we did was also different from many other countries. These were investigated. I appointed the SIU, Special Investigating Unit, to follow up on the various cases, and those are now being prosecuted, and the money is being brought back. I haven't read much about those types of follow-ups in other countries. I have read what has ensued soon after the PPE were issued and the contracts were issued. This is based on how our democracy works and is meant to work. This is based on this solid foundation that we have and the instrument in the hands of our people, which is our Constitution. Now, there are many other things that we do which I find quite different from other countries. The work that is being done, for instance, by our public protector, law enforcement agencies, and we spoke about them. Professor Kachalia, you spoke about them. The SIU, for instance, the Special Investigating Unit, prior in the years, in the last 5 years, these have been the most active years of the SIU. And they have led to a lot of convictions and investigations. And as you heard, the Hawks are investigating up to 21,000 cases. It means work is being done. The National Prosecuting Agency is also at work. What had happened to the NPA, it had been weakened, it had been captured, completely, almost destroyed. The skilled people had left, or they had been railroaded out. And when you talk about prosecutors, you're talking about people who should know their craft. Our courts, our judiciary, and we are proud of an independent judiciary, which even at times when it is attacked, stands firm, independent, and does its work. It's not captured. I digress again for a minute. Yes, thank you. Applaud that. Some years ago, I was traveling to some of our countries on the continent. And Professor Kachalia, as I got onto the plane, I read a newspaper which is published in one of those countries. And one article spoke about how the Chief Justice of a particular country had met somebody in the basement. This was a newspaper article. Met somebody in the basement of a hotel and had received a suitcase full of money. The Chief Justice. And so this reporter was saying, this is what happened to the Chief Justice. And in the same newspaper, I read about the experience or what had happened for what another judge had done in another country on our continent. This judge had gone to pay his condolences to his wife's family. His wife's father had passed away, so he had gone. It's beyond paying your condolences because he's part of the family. This judge meets somebody at the funeral, and this person wants to give this judge an envelope, and the judge refuses to take the envelope. The following day, Chief Justice, was the hearing of a case where this person who was trying to give him the envelope was involved, and he was the presiding officer. And the judge says, before we start these proceedings, I want to recuse myself because this man who is standing here came to my wife's father's home, and he tried to give me an envelope full of money. I refused. But today he's standing right here before me, and I'm the presiding officer. I cannot preside over his case. And these were two stories of judges in two countries which I shall not name on our continent that tell a different story. The one, a judge is captured, the other one is resisting. We are proud to have a judiciary that is not captured, that refuses to be captured, if anybody tries. So we must be proud of that. Now, the work of the State Capture Commission was a watershed moment in our history. And as one travels around the world, people often say, you guys, you wash your linen in public. And I said, that's what our democracy is all about. This is South Africa's democracy at work. Not only did the Commission lay bare the extent and the depth of state capture and corruption, but it also presented the country with the means to both remedy and to deal with the corruption, and also to create conditions that would prevent its recurrence. Viewed overall, the recommendations of the State Capture Commission have provided the country with a clear way forward. And what the Commission laid bare was the extent to which corruption had become so pervasive across the state and across society. During the life of the Commission, Justice Zondo would meet me as state president and come and say, President, we need more money. We need more time. And he kept coming, and I kept saying, yes, we'll give you more time and more money, because I saw the importance of the work. But one of the conversations that we then had was the limitation of the work that the Commission was doing in terms of scope. Because once they had, lifted the lid on corruption, they then realized that it is much more endemic than we had imagined. And it was both private sector and public sector driven. And it had many actors. As Professor Kachalia was saying earlier, many, many actors indeed. And one of the things he reflected on was, and which I also reflected on, was that it's not only at the national departments level or state-owned enterprises level. Much of it manifests itself at local government level. And we both bemoaned the fact that there wasn't enough time, there wasn't enough money, because that is where quite a lot of corruption resided. Now, all this means that we require a society-wide response that marshals all our resources, our capabilities, in a concerted effort to end corruption in all its forms. As part of this effort, last year I appointed this National Anti-Corruption Advisory Council to advise the government, and I would even say to advise all of us, on the necessary means to address the structural causes as well as the consequences of corruption in our country. Part of the work of the National Anti-Corruption Advisory Council is to provide advice on the implementation of the policy and institutional reforms contained in the recommendations of the State Capture Commission. Over the last 5 years, we have invested significant resources to rebuild the law enforcement agencies and other bodies that were devastated by corruption. And I often say to people, what Justice Zondo investigated, in many, many ways, is just the tip of the iceberg. And in fact, the full manifestation of state capture the full impact of state capture is being manifested now, because it is almost like, what do you call it? Is it an amoeba or an octopus that has tentacles that run all over and that grab, and you cut its head off, the tentacles still operate and they run. So we are having to deal with that. The state criminal justice agencies were debilitated, many of them were destroyed, and we are having to rebuild them. We're having to make sure that they gain more capability. I'll talk about this in a little while. We appointed new leadership with a track record and integrity and capability to tackle crime and corruption. And through that, we began introducing a new system. And I often say, what we've got to correct is the system. To correct and rebuild the system, thereafter appoint the right people, and after that, know that those people will implement the correct processes. So it's not an overnight process. It's a process that requires diligence. And in appointing those people, I have decided that we want to be as transparent as possible. We want as many of our people to get engaged so that it is not seen as the sole preserve of the president, where the president will appoint people that he preserves who will foster his own intentions. We are now in the process of developing legislation that will insulate the appointment and removal processes for key positions shown to be vulnerable to state capture. In 2018, we established the NPA Investigating Directorate to focus on state capture and other serious crimes. And this used to be called in the past the Scorpions, and they were dismantled. Now it is more or less, and with nice bells and whistles, going to do the work that is going to focus on corruption. We established the Special Tribunal to enable the Special Investigating Unit to fast-track the recovery of public funds. In November 2020, Cabinet adopted the National Anti-Corruption Strategy with 6 strategic pillars anchored, and we anchored the deliberations of this national dialogue. That will anchor your deliberations. The strategy is an anti-corruption compact, since it is all of society, as I've said, that must get involved in this fight against corruption, both in the state, in business, and in society, as also alluded to by Professor Kachalia. Now, the strategy fills an important gap in that it focuses on preventative measures that complement the actions of our law enforcement agencies and other constitutional bodies in responding to corruption. The strategy aims to stop corruption before it occurs. In my discussions, and our discussions even in cabinet with the Auditor General, I once raised with the Auditor General, you audit. That's what auditors do. They audit the after effect of any financial transactions. And I said, is there no way where we can predict where this is going through your audit processes and come up with clear measures to stop this plane from crashing? And we effected a legislative amendment to give the Auditor General more or less that capability as well, and we need to strengthen it. The areas this strategy covers include ethical leadership, protection, and support of whistleblowers. Now, this is where the National Anti-Corruption Body has now come forward, as Professor Kachalia was saying, with really good and effective recommendations, which we are going to implement, how we should protect whistleblowers. Because in our own country, we know that when whistleblowers speak out, they are targeted from internal structures as well as from external structures. Some of them are even killed and have been killed in the recent past. So they have come up with very good strategies or recommendations of doing so. We've also got to look at the integrity of the procurement systems, because that is where the money is found. And that is where all these thieves, thugs, focus their attention on, because that is the center that dispenses the resources that they want to steal. But we also have to deal with capacity building in our law enforcement agencies. The NDPP has often come and said, we need more money, President and Minister, because we've got to go and employ people who are more capable, because many of those people were railroaded out of the NPA and they've spread throughout the world and throughout many other places. And therefore, we need to capacitate. And this is precisely what Advocate Batoyi has been doing, to rebuild the capacity. And if she ever gets a moment to talk, she will tell us how she found the place hollowed out and how she has had to rebuild that capacity. Now, while these individuals and companies that have enriched themselves at the expense of the people must face the consequences of their misdeeds, we must go deeper if we are going to emerge as a prosperous society. It is now just over a year since I submitted to Parliament government's response to the recommendations of the State Capture Commission. And each time I go to Parliament, the accusation that I have to face, and I'm not blaming you, Chief Justice, because I've often attacked for many things that have nothing to do with you as well, for many others. But the accusation I always have to face is, you are doing nothing about corruption. And I often asked, okay, now to deal with corruption, you've got to investigate corruption. We have institutions that investigate. The president cannot investigate corruption. Because once the president investigates corruption, and once the president arrests those who are corrupt, and once the president prosecutes those who are corrupt, and once the president acts as a judge, then it's time to run for the hills, because it's all lost. I've said my duty as president is to ensure that we strengthen those institutions that should investigate. We also capacitate those institutions that need to arrest and need to prosecute and need to judge. Now, significant progress has been made in implementing a number of measures set out in the response. And of course, the measures may not be all satisfactory to everyone. We have initiated 16 pieces of legislative reforms to address the specific recommendations that the State Capture Commission put forward. 8 of these legislative reforms are now before Parliament. Now, our system of legislation is one of the most elongated systems that you can ever think of in the world. It goes through an elaborate process, and most of it is also constitutionally driven. And those who want to challenge then rush to court, and the courts then say, give government a slap on the face that no, you didn't allow consultation sufficiently. You didn't do it in this area, in this area, in this area. And that lengthens that process. So that is the process we have to go through. These bills that are before Parliament address such areas as public procurement, how we want to tighten up the public procurement process, administrative reform, the conduct of public servants, the intelligence services, money laundering and electoral reform. Precisely the matter that Professor Kachalia was also talking about. The NPA Amendment Bill, for example, creates a permanent, as I said, investigating directorate for corruption in the NPA with significant investigative powers. The Department of Justice and Constitutional Development has recommended significant reforms to the Protected Disclosures Act and the Witness Protection Act in accordance with the Commission's recommendations on enhancing whistleblower protection. The State Capture Commission made recommendations for the establishment of new institutions to safeguard against state capture. Now, these included the establishment of an independent public procurement anti-corruption agency and a permanent commission on corruption and state capture to create an alternative platform for accountability that there should be, so that if legislative measures fail, there should be enough shock absorbers to enable us to be able to ensure that we address this. These and other proposals are the focus of an intensive process of research and consultation, also by the National Anti-Corruption Advisory Council, as you heard. The areas of focus and the diligence that they are paying to their work is really something of legends. And I want to compliment them and to commend them and to thank them for the work that they do on an unpaid basis. And we haven't resourced them enough. And the criticism that has been leveled against us as government is that we haven't given them enough resources. And Professor, we have heard that, and we will make sure that you are properly resourced as a council, because we want you to do your work properly. So you will be resourced, sir. Now, while much work has been done, and indeed much work has been done to strengthen the ability of our institutions to prevent and combat corruption, significant progress has been made in bringing to justice those responsible for state capture. Now, obviously, people often say, we want the big noises, the big names. We want to see them in orange, is it orange? Orange overalls. That's what they want. They want to see the big ones. Now, that's true. We want to see that, but I'll come to that in a minute. 9 separate court cases involving 47 individuals and 21 companies have been brought to court. Now, that is progress. The freezing orders amounting to 14 billion rand have been authorized by the Asset Forfeiture Unit, and a total of 5.4 billion has been recovered and returned to the state. Government department, now that is phenomenal progress. Colleagues and ladies and gentlemen, you don't hear of that much in many other countries. I know we need to do more. We actually need to be getting back to that 14 billion. But to have achieved a recovery through the asset forfeiture unit of 5 billion that had been siphoned out of state coffers is a great achievement. Government departments, municipalities, and professional bodies are taking disciplinary action against individuals identified by the Commission. And the SIU, when I authorized that they should go and investigate, they come back with a report that has a number of recommendations, from arrest, charge, and all that, including disciplinary action. The South African Revenue Service has collected 4.9 billion in unpaid taxes as a result of evidence from the State Capture Commission. So the State Capture Commission, which cost us $1 billion and some change, has more than made its money back. So, Judge, you don't have to feel guilty. While there is a long road ahead, and there is a long road ahead, the fight against corruption is gaining momentum. We obviously, as South Africans, want to see everything done now and today. And I will refer to a particular experience of another country in a minute. So this dialogue is a valuable opportunity for us to mobilize all key stakeholders, to mobilize them behind this effort, from civil society, business and labor, to academia, and to ordinary people in our streets and pathways of our rural areas, as well as government and political parties. So we meet here as diverse constituencies, but with a common purpose. Now, I want to refer to the recent paper by a renowned analyst, Mr. J.P. Landman, whose writings I quite enjoy, because he's both critical of what we do in government, but he also acknowledges the progress that we are making. His most recent paper or newsletter, and I want to quote what he said. He says, in 2021, 2 researchers published a paper on a period of rife corruption in the United States between 1865 and 1941, he writes. They distilled 4 lessons from that period. Their first finding was that it is possible to make a transition from a systematically corrupt political system to a system in which public corruption is aberrational. Now, some of us who are interested in the histories of various countries, which is often depicted either in the bioscopes, or movies or videos, as well as in writing, will remember how during a period in America, gangsters and all manner of thugs and thieves were just running riot. So they looked at 1865 to 1941 and said corruption was endemic all over. And the paper specifically rejected the notion that an entrenched culture of corruption is virtually impossible to dislodge. And he writes, South Africans can take comfort from this, because at times we think that what we are going through is unique, and many other countries have never gone through it, and we will never get out of this. Secondly, he writes, the U.S. transition away from systematic corruption was incremental, was also uneven and slow. There was no big bang moment. Some you win, some you lose. Again, South Africans can relate to this as we consider the first state capture case, the Nulani case, which the NPA is now appealing, which when the case was lost, everybody just piled criticism on the NPA and said, you see how useless they are. Because for a technical reason, they had lost a very important case, which they are now appealing. And people also talk about the fumbling on TV of the prosecution in the Senzo Meyiwa trial. And such defeats, he says in his paper, are painful, but are not the end of the story. Thirdly, he says, reduction in systematic corruption coincided with a substantial, that is in the US, with a substantial expansion of government in size and power. That is more resources going into the fight. Beware the budget cuts, he says, for the NPA and the courts. That we've become alive to. Because the more we shortchange and short budget the NPA and the courts, the more they will not be able to fulfill their mandate. Now here I think I'm giving an opening to Chief Justice Zondo when he comes to talk to government about more money for the courts. And fourthly, they say, institutional reforms played a key role in the US fight against corruption. Progress involved a combination of direct strategies, such as aggressive arrests and prosecutions, and indirect strategies, such as civil service reform and other institutional changes. Now, South Africa's, he continues, titanic struggle against crime and corruption is not unique. It happened in the US, it happened in Singapore, in Italy, in Ukraine, and China is now fighting the same fight. One lesson from the US experience, he continues, is that progress is incremental. It's also uneven and slow. But there is progress. Money is recovered, in our case that is, and cases that are enrolled, new institutions that are being created and capacity that is being strengthened is what is happening in South Africa. In the process, values also shift. And this is what we are now seeing unfolding in our own country. And sometimes we think that we're the only ones. And of course, we must hasten and ensure that the fight against corruption goes on. We are here at this summit to identify further measures that we need to take to build a South Africa that does not allow for corruption or capture. We now know what state capture has done to our country. And we're continuing to live through the after effects of state capture. And it is a place where we never want to go back. We are here to strengthen our shared determination to build an ethical society founded on the values of our Constitution. Now, I can only wish you a successful dialogue. And as Professor Kachalia said, that this is a very important moment in the life of our country when we will talk about further strategies that we need to embark upon to fight corruption. And let it be said that the fight against corruption is not only for the SIU, the police, the Hawks, the NPA, or our courts. It's a societal fight. It's not only what the president does. It's all of society. Now, all of us must engage in this. And I want to remind us, the State Capture Commission would most probably never have been appointed had the people of South Africa not stood up and said, enough is enough. It would never have been appointed. And if the people of South Africa had not rallied behind the commission when it was being attacked and when people Some of them in high positions were even saying it must be closed. The people of this country said, no, we're not going to allow that. So similarly, the fight against corruption is all of us working together. And I often say when it comes to crime as well, as I end, when it comes to criminality, we've got 95,000 police in our country. We are adding. Between last year and this year, we are going to be adding up to 30,000 even next year. Because our population and ratio and the number of police is out of skew. But those police will never be in every household. They will never be in every street. They will never be in every locale. In the end, the fight against criminality is also a societal one. Now, whenever I'm at rallies, I often tell our people that quite often we know as communities, we know the people who get involved in criminality. We know them. The people who go and break into people's houses, the people who go and steal. We even know the people who go and rape and murder people. And we don't speak out. And I say it is up to us as well to speak out, to make sure that we root out criminality, working together with the police, working together in community policing forums, where we become the eyes and the ears of our people as a whole. And similarly, when it comes to corruption, it is our duty, all of us. It is a societal challenge, and I hope that this summit is going to come up with a lot of strategies and measures that we need to take to push back on corruption and end corruption in South Africa. Thank you very much.
Thank you, thank you. Our first citizen has spoken.